Hello there and good afternoon to L24 News special coverage of Ukraine-Russia conflicts. Russian forces are concentrating on Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, but continue to face stiff resistance, the UK's defense ministry said, in the areas Russia has taken under its control, which may soon hold fake referenda as US and Ukrainian officials have warned. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky's office says it has planned operation to evacuate civilians from the blockade Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol, the last holdout against Russian forces in the bombed city. Meanwhile, Russian strikes shook residential buildings in Kiev overnight as the UN chief and Bulgarian prime minister visited the city. Now, after more than 2 months, Germany, one of the countries that shifted its policy toward Ukraine. German parliament on Thursday instructed the government to boost military support for Ukraine and sent pointed warnings to China and Serbia over the support to Russia. These heavy weapons to Ukraine, including anti-aircraft tanks, which is considered to some extent a direct intervention, as Russia made its interpretation to the situation. British, on the other hand, are being reported of provoking an act over the Russian lands throughout Ukraine. To this point, questions are raised. Is Germany ready to enter this war? And why would the British and US push the escalation forward, firstly refusing any kind of negotiations? And what is the call of Ukraine on that? Multiple questions are directed to our panel of guests. We have Mr. Challenger, Vice Chairman of Schiller Institute from Germany, and Mr. Dennis Speed, a founding member of Schiller Institute as well from USA. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in this debate. Show begins right after this break. And before delving into our debate, let me read for you this piece of information. Ladies and gentlemen, a petition on providing Ukraine with heavy arms was approved by majority of Germany's Bundestag lower house of parliament on Thursday. The petition was supported by both the three parties in the ruling coalition as well as the opposition conservatives, passing with 586 votes in favor and 100 against and 7 abstentions, according to Bundestag Vice President Wolfgang Kubik. Mr. Halley, since you are a German, I will be starting with you. As it is clearly seen, Russia now is not fighting only Ukraine, but rather majority of NATO countries. The question raised now, how and why Germany shifted its policy directly and started this military backup to Ukraine? Isn't a risky move against Russia taken into consideration that Germany is already suffering from this operation?
Well, let me correct you on one thing. I'm not German, I'm an American, but I live in Germany.
Living in Germany, yeah.
And have been living here for 6 years. The vote in the Bundestag followed this meeting at Ramstein Air Base, presided over by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. The background to this is that the German Chancellor Scholz, who's relatively new in office, when he came in, said that he had no intention of providing weapons to Ukraine nor being engaged in the war there. Now, what's happened is his coalition partners, including the Greens, who are very much committed to a war against Russia, and the Free Democrats, were lobbying him hard. But even more importantly, the US and the British have placed enormous pressure on Germany. They've accused Germany of being disloyal to NATO, of not supporting the freedom and independence of the West. And so there's been an incredible campaign of psychological pressure put on President or Chancellor Scholz. This includes attacks on one of his predecessors, Gerhard Schröder, the former German chancellor, who during the Iraq War opposed joining the coalition to fight in Iraq. So Schroeder now works for Gazprom, and he's being attacked by his former party members, party mates in the Social Democrats. So there's enormous pressure on the government. Now, I can tell you the majority of the German people are asleep. They have little understanding of what's at stake here. And they certainly don't know what President Putin said the other day when he said that they will consider any country that acts against Russia's interests to be co-belligerents, that is, to be part of the war. So this is the danger that we face now in Germany of being labeled part of the Ukraine and NATO attack against Russia.
Understood. We will come to this point with further details. Mr. Speed, recently, don't you think that there are so many countries and even organizations looking forward to help Ukraine? Don't you think that this direct help comes only because there is a sense of Ukraine is winning the war against Russia?
I think it's the opposite. I think what's actually happening is that the United States is attempting to bail out the United States military-industrial complex in part. Because what's actually happening in these arrangements, if you watch carefully, is that the intention is going to be to give old American and other equipment, Soviet equipment also, to Ukraine. That's going to come from Poland, it'll come from Germany and others. Then what will happen is that the United States will send to the others new equipment from the United States. Also,
Let's move to the second point before coming up again with Mr. Denis. Foreign Minister spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said on Thursday that Western countries are openly calling on Ukraine to attack Russia, adding that the West should take Moscow seriously when it says strikes on Russian territory will lead to response.
The West is openly calling on Kiev to attack Russia, including with the use of weapons received from NATO countries. Kiev took it as a guide to action. In the last few weeks, Ukrainian armed forces shelled areas near Russia-Ukraine border, resulting in casualties and destruction. Kiev and Western capitals should take seriously the statement by our country's defense ministry that further inciting of Ukraine to strike Russian territory will definitely lead to a tough response from Russia.
В результате имеются пострадавшие, разрушения. Особое беспокойство вызывают факты системы.
We are alarmed by the escalation of tensions in Transnistria, where in recent days there have been several incidents with shootings, explosions of official installation and infrastructure. We consider these actions as acts of terrorism aimed at destabilizing the situation in the region, and we expect a thorough and objective investigation into the circumstances surrounding what happened. We strongly condemn attempts to implicate Transnistria in what is happening in Ukraine.
Staying with you, Mr. Speed, as it is claimed, do you believe that the Anglosphere, US, UK, wants this war to continue as long as it serves their interest? And could Moscow manage to stand longer facing this whole gathering against its existence?
Yeah, I think that Moscow is not going to have a problem with the situation. I think they're going to actually do rather well. I also don't believe that the situation on the ground is as it's being reported, because the Russians were never trying to take Kiev. What they were trying to do and what's going on here, which is that there's a violation, of course, that the United States has committed. The constitutional lawyer Bruce Fein, very well known in America because of his going back to the time of Watergate, has pointed out that the war clause has actually been violated by the United States in these actions, because the United States, by providing, it violates the condition of neutrality because it's providing weapons, material, logistics, and training to countries that are providing them to belligerents. And also the United States is doing direct training, as we know from Biden. This actually requires an act of Congress. What Biden may be trying to do by re-invoking what's called Lend-Lease and doing that through the Congress is avoiding getting a declaration of war from the Congress of the United States. It's very important to recognize that the United States never declared war against Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq or Vietnam. Why? Because you cannot get a declaration of war through the American people, that is the Congress. And the Congress is abdicating its responsibility, throwing it to the presidency. And that allows British intelligence, British defense sectors, and the Americans, particularly the general from Raytheon, Lloyd Austin, he should be called General Raytheon, who are basically trying to prop up the American military and bring them in, and meaning the military-industrial complex. They will sell things to Germany and Poland and so on, and Poland, Germany, also Greece for that matter, will all be pressured to give whatever equipment they've got to Ukraine. It's also better because the Ukrainians are trained to use old Soviet-era equipment, which people like the Poles will have, or Bulgaria will have, or others will have. And that's what the deal really is here.
Quite understood. Mr. Howley, you previously stated in this show that the British are masters of disinformation, and now several reports are coming out that UK is preparing for an attack over the Russian lands. Is that true or fake report to create another propaganda that push Russia to justify its operation?
Well, there's the Minister of the Armed Forces in the United Kingdom named James Heapy, and he said it would be perfectly legitimate for Ukraine to use weapons provided by the British to attack locations and targets inside Russia. That's what Zakharova was talking about in that clip you showed a moment ago, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman. The idea that the British are saying it's legitimate to target Russia with advanced weapons coming from Britain, and we just know Boris Johnson, who's got his own problems inside England, was just in Kiev promising new weapons to the Ukrainians. If those are used to target Russian locations, what President Putin is saying is, don't be shocked if you're hit by a lightning strike. We've already warned you, we've given you notice, and this is extremely dangerous. And again, I think the people in the United Kingdom, just like most Germans, aren't aware that this is not just a pep talk or cheerleading for the brave Ukrainians. This is now putting lives in Germany and United Kingdom on the line. And as you pointed out earlier, the countries such as Germany are already suffering the effects of the war from the inflation, the likely loss of gas and oil. We're seeing inflation running about 40% for utility costs. Gas prices at the pump are up 50 to 75%, and it's going to get worse. So by choosing to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia, it's now backfiring or boomeranging back against the Western populations. And it could get worse if there are these attacks against Russia coming from Ukraine using weapons provided by Germany and the United Kingdom.
Definitely that would be worse. Russian President Vladimir Putin warns against outside intervention in Ukraine conflicts, promising it will be met with a swift and withering response.
If someone intends to interfere from the outside in what is happening and to create unacceptable threats for the strategic nature of Russia, they must know that our response will be quick and with lightning.
I will stay with you, Mr. Howley, since you have already mentioned this point. The West is planning to make military moves against Moscow. Putin, on the other hand, is threatening to react against each act. In the light of these events, are we on the brink of another world war? Let me say, the World War III?
Well, it's moving in that direction very rapidly, but I think it's also important to note that outside of Europe, most nations are not supporting the escalation against Russia. In fact, the vote at the UN to strip Russia of its membership of the UN Human Rights Commission, nations representing 1/3 of the world's population voted for the anti-Russian measures, but nations representing 2/3 of the world's population either abstained or voted against. We're seeing a realignment underway, and this is why the British in particular are panicking. The realignment is based on the Russia-Chinese economic agreement, which is moving toward the possibility of breaking with the Western neoliberal financial system, which is crashing. And so the idea that Russia and China are on the defensive, actually they're offering an alternative to countries that don't accept the policies of the International Monetary Fund and the global bankers that are a form of new colonialism. And so that's why so many countries in the South are lining up against the American and the British assault on Russia.
Mr. Speed, what are you saying about this? How can you read Putin's words? Is he really threatening or he is just promising?
Putin is responding to threats coming from the United States. For example, there's this former U.S. Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy by the name of Seth Crosby. He just wrote an article called "The U.S. Can Show That It Can Win a Nuclear War." And this literally just came out. Now, for those of us that are old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, we remember that there was a general by that time called Curtis LeMay. And he talked about how the United States could win a nuclear war with the Soviet Union at that time with minimal casualties. This guy says the same thing. He says, instead, NATO could decapitate the Kremlin. Yes, suffering casualties in the process, but still decapitated. And he's talking about using nuclear weapons. So Putin knows this, and he's an intelligence officer. And so what he's aware of is, if you take, for example, the actual incursion into Ukraine that was done by the Russians, this was they found documents which they then displayed, which indicated that there was an attack that was intended by the Ukrainian forces on Donbass, on Lugansk and Donetsk. And they were not going to stand by and allow that attack to occur. So the concept here to understand is that Putin is operating with a combination of capabilities. One, he's an intelligence officer. Two, he knows the United States very well. Three, he was there for the period of Russian humiliation from 1991 to 99 and saw the intentions of, quote, the West, the Americans and the British. And therefore, he's making a very specific point. He tried to negotiate. He made it available, made the concepts available. And I'd like to even, by the way, just let it be known that the former National Security Advisor of Germany, Telchik, who was there with Kohl, stated just yesterday that the expansion of NATO to the east should not have occurred, and that the Ukrainians should have negotiated at Minsk. Mm-hmm. What we're seeing here is that the president of Russia had no choice except to act, given what we now see, which is that we are about to see every 30 countries arrayed in a conflict in which Ukraine is given just enough to continue and just enough to allow for massive contracts to suddenly be signed and to be conducted with a reorganized, remilitarized Germany and many other countries.
Mm-hmm, perfectly. And so now moving on to another point, the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy on Thursday stressed that bloc's unity on dealing with Russia, saying Moscow will not be paid in rubles for gas and that more punitive measures have not been ruled out. Russian state energy company Gazprom earlier this week cut off natural gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria due to their refusal to pay in rubles, a demand from Moscow that most of the countries of the EU reject.
We have the ability to pump back gas supplies and distribute them between us, because it is not just a one-way transit. Within the European network, gas can flow from one country to another. The sanctions will continue and their effects will be felt. They are already being felt and will be felt more and more.
Mr. Harley, coming back to you, except Hungary in Europe, the only country that approved to pay Russian gas by ruble, and Russia now is cutting off its gas to anyone who refuses to pay as follow, such as Poland and Bulgaria. So, how can Europe survive without the availability of Russian gas? Are there any alternatives ready to be used?
Well, let me tell you first of all that Borrell was lying. Because there are European countries rather that are getting Russian oil and gas that are redistributing it, that are offering it to Poland and elsewhere. So the idea that they can do without Russian gas is a fraud. But let me just quote to you from some German industrialists, including the head of the major chemical company BASF or the auto sector. They're saying that there will be 1.5 to 2 million layoffs in industry in Germany if the gas is cut off from Russia to Germany. They're saying this will provoke an all-out recession, if not a depression. The idea that solar and wind power can replace the oil and gas from Russia is a complete fraud, and they know it. They're hoping they can find other ways of bringing in oil and gas, including trying to get some from Algeria. But the other problem they have is that they don't even have the terminals that are available to take the liquefied natural gas. They rejected the Russian Nord Stream 2, which would have been a perfect instrument to provide oil and gas to avoid any kind of problems for the West. And I think this is an example of the kind of suicidal mentality where the European Union arrogantly thinks that they're on the right path and they're going to be able to punish Russia. But the punishment is going to go to the average European, the average person in Germany or in Italy or in Greece, who will lose their job, will not be able to heat their homes next winter. They're already talking about blackouts in Germany coming next fall. So I think what Borrell and others are talking about is nonsense. And they're trying to hype up their populations to keep the flow of arms going into Ukraine. And it's not just to make money for the military-industrial complex. It's to punish Russia and degrade Russia's economy so that Russia is not able to work with China toward establishing a new financial system. And the Russian ruble payment for gas is part of a potential new financial system, a ruble that's backed by something real, physical economic goods, timber, raw materials, grain, oil and gas, and gold, as opposed to the funny money system that's existing in the West.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Speed, the EU's chief executive Ursula von der Leyen on Wednesday called the Russian giant Gazprom's move to halt supplies to some European customers as a blackmail. How can you explain these words? Aren't the sanctions imposed on Russia also a blackmail?
If you've expropriated $340 billion, literally expropriated, you know, the kinds of things that the Russian Communist Party was accused of in 1917, because they were just not paying the debts. I mean, they came in, they were in a war. So, I mean, how can you say that this is blackmail? There's another thing, by the way, I want to point out. There's a professor by the name of Franco Battaglia. He's a professor of physical chemistry at the University of Modena. And here's what he says. He says, this entire idea that these sanctions are going to work is a complete fraud because they're going to be getting gas from Turkey through the Blue Stream pipeline. This is the same fraud, by the way, that they've committed when they talk about what the real story was around the Ukraine war in the first place. You know what was going on? What happened was Russia had a deal with Ukraine, a free trade deal. That was through the European Economic Union. Okay, so Ukraine's idea was, okay, maybe we can work with the EU and we can work with the EU. But the problem was the Russians said, wait a minute, we've got a free trade deal with you, but we have different deals with the other countries of the West. Okay, and it involves some tariffs and other things. So we can't have you join the EU, because if you join the EU, all of our treaties with them get violated. They're just going to go through you. Here's what you do. You just say, hey, why don't you just work with everybody? And that's what was attempted by the regime that was couped in the Donbass. The day they announced, why can't we all just get along, so to speak, that's when the whole process began. It's the same thing with what von der Leyen's doing here. This stuff is all subterfuge, smoke and mirrors. And the people who know what they're doing know the game very well.
Perfectly understood. Now, the last point to be discussed, U.S. President Joe Biden signed a new decree which will give more aid for the Ukrainian government in its conflict against Moscow. Biden stated that the cost of supporting Ukraine as they fight against Russia has moved up, as the last bill reached $33 billion.
I just signed a request to Congress for critical security, economic, and humanitarian assistance to help Ukraine continue to counter Putin's aggression, and at a very pivotal moment. We need this bill to support Ukraine in this fight for freedom, and our NATO allies, our EU partners, they're going to pay their fair share of the cost as well, but we have to do this. We have to do our part as well. The cost of this fight is not cheap, but caving to aggression is going to be more costly if we allow it to happen. We either back Ukrainian people as they defend their country, or We stand by as the Russians continue their atrocities and aggression in Ukraine.
5 minutes left to cut the show, so let's divide it between you and Mr. Hanley, Mr. Speed. Mr. Hanley, how can you explain this huge expenditure from US toward Ukraine? Why US didn't manage to help any other country before, such as Ukraine now?
Well, I think this is something that Dennis Speed was talking about earlier, a bailout of the defense corporations. But it also, look, there are people losing homes in the United States. There are people who can't afford food for their children. There's no money for infrastructure, no money for health care. Yet we come up with $33 billion on top of the $4 to $5 billion that's already been spent. So what this shows is the priorities in Washington are determined by the leading banks and financial corporations that are trying to keep a nearly bankrupt economy going. The U.S. just reported a decline in its economic growth of 1.4% in the last quarter. So you add to that money going into what's essentially worthless expenditures, because once you pay for weapons, the money's gone. It's not like machine tools or tractors or things of that sort. So this is just a doubling down on the economic insanity that's run by the neoliberal and neoconservative forces that control the US government and also have power in the European Union.
Mr. Speed, this war pushed US to use its energy reserve to overcome the shortage happening in this field. Now, after more than 2 months, can US keep this policy as a principle to face this dilemma?
Well, let's just say something first about what you just asked about before, because you got a royal scam going on here. See, the British like to spend American money, and the way they do it is through the process of defense contracts. Back during the period of the Cheney-Bush administration, Cheney's wife, Liz Cheney, had this deal with Baroness Liz Simmons. And the two of them were actually the coordinators for almost $500 billion in defense contracts. So what you're hearing is that. Now, in terms of what Harley said about the impoverishment of the American people, that's who's paying for this. By the way, the Ukrainians are also paying for it. These aren't grants to Ukraine. All this stuff is loans. They're going to have to pay this back. So all the way around, everywhere you got it coming and going, what's actually going on here is an incentive. Now, this is not the purpose of the war. The purpose of the war is to destroy Russia, and in fact, to destroy China by destroying Russia. That's the conception, because that's where the actual focus is. And the reason for that is because the United States and other countries in the transatlantic are no longer productive nations. They don't make anything any longer. And as a result of their moving away from that, what they've got is weapons. What they've got is war. And they've got a massive debt. So what's happening here is the gas prices in the United States, which are $6, $7 a gallon, all these other things. Of course, there's this carrot that the U.S. will sell, liquefied natural gas and stuff like that, to the Europeans. But the truth is, this is a royal scam. And dead bodies in Ukraine are a small price to pay on the part of Wall Street and the City of London.
Understood. Mr. Hanley, what are you saying and commenting over these statements? They are trying to harm Russia just to destroy China. So China is the main goal.
Well, it was announced the last couple of days that China has to be a focus. Liz Truss, the foreign secretary in England, said that, look, this is the beginning of a global war. And she's talking about a global British empire with the United States as the money for it and the military force for it. This is what Lyndon LaRouche identified many, many years ago, that the United States is a dumb giant on a British leash. And the irony here is that the United States was the original anti-colonial force in the world because we made a revolution against the British Empire. So why are we doing the dirty work of the City of London? And I think this is the thing we have to wake up in the American people, the sense that the American system is a productive economic system that has to be extended to the whole world, as opposed to protecting the British colonial system in its new form, Global Britain, which is opposing China because of China's willingness to help other nations develop.
Quite understood. Mr. Harley Schlanger from Germany, Mr. Dennis Speed from USA. thank you so much for your presence with us in this special coverage. I really do appreciate your presence. Judith and ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. A special coverage also will be held tomorrow. For now, have a blessed evening.